Okay, so let's move on to number 3, and this one is something that I've had a philosopher on my channel to talk about, and it's actually one of my favorite videos that I've done. So the objection or the slogan or whatever you want to call it is, if you had been born elsewhere, then you probably wouldn't be a Christian. So that's the basic rundown of it. What are your thoughts on that, like that type of slogan?
Well, I think for a start, it's of course true. Geography is a reliable statistical indicator of religious belief. But there are a lot of things to say on this. Firstly, we have to be careful.
Real quick, on the point of geography, if you actually look at a map of the demographics of Christianity, Christianity is like the only religion, the last time that I looked, Christianity is the only religion that is sort of geographically not centrally located. So it's like everywhere.
Yes.
So
yet still, the problem is that Christianity is a very individualistic, personal religion. It's about an individual's relationship with God. It may be the case that there are lots of hubs of Christianity all over the world, and there's no place you can point to that's like the Mecca of Christianity. However, it is still true that if you're born in Medina, or if you're born in Mecca, or if you're born in Indonesia, you're far less likely to become a Christian, to be a Christian, than were you born in Texas, for example. And this does seem to require some explanation. Now, of course, you'll be told that it commits the genetic fallacy to say that, oh, the reason that you're Christian is because you were born a Christian. That doesn't make Christianity false. Of course it doesn't. But there are different ways this objection can be formulated. If I say something like, well, Christianity seems not to be true because the only reason that you're a Christian is because you were born in Texas, then that would, of course, be fallacious. It doesn't make Christianity false that you came to it through the wrong means.
Like you said, the genetic fallacy.
That is the genetic fallacy. But there are versions of this objection, bearing in mind that a lot of the time when an objection is put forward, somebody isn't being super careful with their words. They're trying to drive at an idea, and I think we have to avoid being pedantic and saying, well, technically that commits this fallacy, because what is it they're getting at? And I think with this observation, what they're getting at is the fact that it does seem troubling, and I talked about this in my debate with Jonathan McLatchy, the second one. Does it not seem troubling to you? I'll ask you what I asked him.
Sure.
That, at least on a Christian worldview, your place of birth seems to be a reliable statistical indicator of how likely you are to be saved. That seems to be troubling. Now, this isn't the kind of thought or problem that commits the genetic fallacy. You must think that that's at least a little bit troubling. It's something you at least have to kind of work on and think about. You can't dismiss it as a logically fallacious argument or something. Why is it that this is the case? This, to me, falls under the umbrella of divine hiddenness. Why does God hide his face more from somebody living in Rwanda than to somebody living in Thailand, which is something like 95% Buddhist and therefore, at best, 5% theistic? Could it be that, you know, the Thai are just naturally 20 times more predisposed to being stubborn, or to not engaging with argument, or to, you know, not seeing the revelation that's been made so obvious around them, so that they are without excuse, as Paul says in Romans? That doesn't seem right to me. We do seem to need an explanation of how there could be a God who wants to come to know every individual on the planet, and yet allows a situation to obtain in which we have a statistically reliable indicator of how likely someone is to be saved purely based on where they're born. Surely that's a problem.
Well, I like how you turn this into like, from what it was into like an argument from divine hiddenness. I think that's actually like, it can be helpful, because that's one interpretation of how this objection can be put.
Yes, but you can imagine if somebody's raising that objection, they might say something like, you know, because look, if you were born in Medina, you'd probably be a Muslim. That, of course, isn't an argument on its own, but clearly when people say things like this, they're euphemizing, or they're using a shorthand for a line of thought which can be syllogized if we're careful, but most conversations aren't done in syllogistic form, as we well know. It's quite strange the way that whenever you watch the conversations online and these kinds of things, that we're always very careful to define our terms. This isn't how human beings usually interact. Of course, our job as apologetics or trying to kind of make philosophy accessible, our job is to take these thoughts that people have and try to make them specific and syllogize them. And so, although the statement itself is not an argument on its own, and certainly not a very good one if it were, I think it is a shorthand for something which is a very important argument.
Yeah, so my basic thoughts, and I kind of align with Joe Schmidt on this, is that, well, first of all, there's kind of built into this idea that salvation is something that's like sort of exclusive to only those that have like heard the gospel. And so I'm what you might call an inclusivist. I think that it's possible to be saved apart from having conscious knowledge of Christ, and there's different reasons for that. And then there's also the fact that I'm like a hopeful universalist, so I feel like, or at least I'm hopeful of the idea that everyone will eventually be saved. So that's
one way around it. It seems a little bit ad hoc to me for somebody to say, especially if you say that the reason why you're an inclusivist is because of this problem of geographical predictability.
So yeah, no, that's not the reason why.
But I'd imagine it's not.
Yeah.
But if somebody did that as a response, it would seem like a bit of a disposal problem.
Well, I'm just pointing out one like sort of assumption behind the argument.
Yes.
Is that like, does this determine whether or not you're saved? I don't think that's what's going to determine.
I'm inclined to take the same view. I think if I were a Christian, I'd be at least an inclusivist. I don't think I'd be a universalist, because I think it's clear that Christ implies that those who do.
Have you seen some of the philosophical arguments in favor of universalism?
I've seen a few.
I mean, there's atheists who have them, and they're decent.
Yes.
Like the philosophical, I'm not saying the scriptural arguments, but the philosophical arguments can actually be kind of powerful.
The philosophical arguments are going to be incredibly steadfast, especially because it does seem unethical to send people to hell as long as there's such thing as a non-resistant non-believer, as Schellenberg famously formulated it. It seems troubling to send them to hell through no fault of their own. But it does seem to me that scripturally we have good reason to think that those who make it to heaven are those who do the will of the Father. This isn't the same thing as being a nominal Christian. Being, of course, like at the time of Jesus, there was no such thing as Christianity. There was what we would kind of now call Christianity, but Christianity was just kind of following Christ. And to follow Christ is essentially to do the will of the Father. Now, there's an interesting consideration here, which is that, sure, you're more likely to be a Christian if you're born in Texas than if you're born in Malaysia. But are you more likely to do the will of the Father? Sure, there might be a lot of nominal Christians in Texas, but are they actually living a life that is the kind of life that guarantees them salvation? Just because they call themselves a Christian, that's not going to be enough to establish salvation. You may well find that you're actually more likely to be saved on a Christian worldview if you grew up in Malaysia than if you grew up in Texas, because although you wouldn't be a nominal Christian, you might be more inclined to be doing the will of the Father. And I think if you kind of looked around at the way people behave, get rid of the labels and just look at how are they actually behaving? How are they interacting with their fellow human? Are they good people? Do they love their friends? Do they love their enemies? You might find that globally there isn't actually a geographical distribution problem, because people are kind of equally able to do that regardless of where they are on the planet. And if that is what the basis for salvation is, then the problem kind of goes away. Jesus didn't say, no one comes unto the Father except through knowledge of me. He said, no one comes unto the Father except through me. If Jesus is the radically compassionate figure that Christians portray him to be, one way to make him even more compassionate is to say that he died for the sins even of those who didn't know that he did it for them, but he did it for them anyway. So if I were a Christian, I think I'd take an inclusivist approach, but not a universalist approach, because you could still fail to do the will of the Father. You can still fail to be a good person and still end up not being able to inherit eternal life. But it's got nothing to do with being a nominal Christian. Yeah,
that's actually, I think we're probably on board, or I'm on board with that, because to me it seems at least possible that someone could continually like choose to want to remain distant from God, like eternally. That at least seems plausible. Like some people just really, really don't like God.
It makes so much more sense as well if you take an annihilationist view. I think a lot of the ideas of hell being a real place, the philosopher Kvanvig has, I think, 5 theses of traditional hell. There's the fact that it's a real place that actually exists, the fact that that there are actually people in it, that is, hell isn't empty. I think it's 4 actually. The third was that everyone who's there deserves to be there. And the 4th is the inescapability thesis, that once you're there, you can't escape. This is like the idea of traditional hell. But I think the idea of hell being a real place of fire and brimstone, the imagery in the Bible isn't clear on this. I think that a lot of the time, there's a common problem of failing to, or mistaking allegory for literal prediction or truth. And I think there's a good case to be made that annihilationism is the best way to interpret those who don't go to heaven. If you take an inclusivist view that says that doing the will of the Father, not being a nominal Christian, is what gives you eternal life, and that if you don't have eternal life, you just die, you just cease to exist, the problem of ethics of geographical distribution and the problem of punishing non-believers goes away. Again, this could be seen as ad hoc, but of course, if God is the grounding of being itself, take like the contingency argument, which says that things don't just have a temporal cause. The reason that they are sustained in existence, the reason that stuff exists now in any particular time slice is because it is being sustained by God. What does it mean to separate yourself from God? What does it mean to separate yourself from the ground of being? Seems to be to separate yourself from being and therefore to not exist. And so I think that there's a good kind of philosophical case to be made for annihilationism. And then the problem goes away. You have, look, here's an offer to you. If you want to inherit eternal life, if you want to do the will of the Father, then you can come and be with the Father. If you don't want that, it would be unethical to force someone to go through that. That's the usual Christian line. The response is that, oh, what, but does such a person deserve hell? I think certainly not, unless hell is just to not exist. If somebody says, look, I just don't want it, I just want to die, he'll let them die. Now, of course, I'm an atheist. I don't think any of this is true.
Yeah.
But if I were a Christian...
We're looking at different possible responses.
This is how I would make sense of the claim. If you don't do something like that, if you do believe in the traditional Kvanvigian idea of hell, I think there is a huge problem here. Equally, I think that if you think you need to actually be a Christian, but accept Jesus's resurrection in some kind of proactive sense, then there is a problem. Of course, you can say, well, Jesus can still save those who haven't heard the gospel because they're saved on the light that they reject. But of course, there are people like me. I consider myself to be a non-resistant non-believer. It's not that I'm not a Christian because I haven't heard the gospel. It's because I have heard the gospel, but find it, let's say, factually unconvincing, if not morally unconvincing, and factually unconvincing. And so even if you have this disposal problem sorted for those who never heard of Christ, you've still got a disposal problem for people like me, non-resistant non-believers who have heard the gospel. If you think that I'm going to be going to a real place called hell to be punished for my kind of passive non-belief just because I happen to be unconvinced, then I don't know what I could be doing differently. I don't know what I could be doing wrong to deserve that. I tried to engage in the arguments. I got a degree in theology. I lived with Christian housemates. I read as much as I can and widely as I can, and I'm just unconvinced. To say that I deserve to go to hell because of this, because somehow I don't want this, this imagery of God saying, well, look, if you don't want to come to heaven, you don't have to, man. The gates of hell are locked from the inside. That works for somebody who's a resistant non-believer, who says, I don't want it to be true. I don't want to worship God. But I'm somebody I'm like, no, I do want this. I would love to inherit eternal life. I'd love to be the recipient of endless love and see my dead relatives again and to worship what deserves to be worshipped. But I just don't think it's true. That's not somebody for whom God can just say, well, look, man, if you don't want it, you don't have to have it. I do want it. But I'm told that is not a sufficient condition for actually receiving it. You have to want it, but also somehow be convinced that it's there and that you can actually grab it. That's a harder problem to deal with.
Yeah, I'd have to think more about that, whether or not that's a requirement, whether you've got to believe it. Because I know that there's a guy, his name is Michael Rhoda, and he's got an updated version of Pascal's wager. And he basically wants to lower the bar for natural theology. So instead of getting you to 70 to 80% in order to become a Christian, he's like, as long as he can get you to around the 50% mark, then he says at that point, you don't necessarily have to believe, but you can start to do things like a Christian would, like go to church, and you can do other things, and you can pray, and you can read the Bible, and you can go to fellowship and Bible study, and there's other things that you can do. You don't necessarily have to have belief. But then the question is, yeah, could a person be saved apart from that conscious knowledge? And I think that's definitely possible on my view of Christianity. Hello, Cameron here. Thanks for watching this little clip. If you want more, there's actually a whole interview this clip came from. Just click the link on the screen. Oh, and by the way, we post 2 to 3 new videos a week. So if you're interested in apologetics at all, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you can catch our latest content. Oh, and then lastly, remember that Christianity is true.